Um, Nice to see you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I kind of caught the end of the last one and got the energy of this whole presentation, so it was very refreshing. So I'm just going to jump right in. I am an architect by training, and I want to tell a little story, and I think I'm going to call this my origin story in terms of our own journey through teal organizations and trying to become one in our own right as a firm. And I'm going to tell you a little story about some of the work that we do. I started as an architect learning how to design for people and stumbled onto and learned a methodology about how we design with our clients. And it became a drug to me. It was really a satisfying experience. And the beauty of this concept of designing with instead of for is powerful, because I believe it has an ability not only to work well for teal clients and teal organizations, but I actually think it enhances the health of a teal team when we design together. And so that's my story today. And I'm just going to jump right into my slideshow here if I can find it. And get it started if I can. It looks like it's working now. If I can turn the little start thing, I can move this out of the way here. There we go. Okay. I want to lay down just a little bit of concept here in this methodology and process. And I want to talk about the kind of the triad of pieces that we have certainly learned about in designing with a group of people. And it's about connection, imagination, and idea. And the first piece, connection, is about understanding the group that we're working with. And that has a lot to do with understanding the level of respect and trust in the organization, understanding the power differential, understanding communication style, all those issues that define how an organization works together, and having some awareness of that, which requires some research in advance. The second element is about the issue of imagination. Being humans, that's something we all have in common. In fact, we're the only species on the globe that actually has an imagination, the ability for us to imagine something that does not exist. That's unique to us. And the challenge here is how to stimulate that in a group of people. And oftentimes, depending on the organization type, sometimes that's, stilted. It's hard to get imagination out of someone if, it's been latent and not been challenged or brought to the surface. And the third piece here is about ideas and how ideas infect groups of people. And I want to share here a little definition, if I can. Well, come on, advance forward. Bear with me, I'm not advancing. Why am I not advancing? That's strange. Oh, here we go. I can do it this way. Okay, got it. Here's a definition, and I want to just read it out to you. An idea is a creature with both rational and emotional characteristics that has the intent to be realized. To do so, it must be drawn through the chambers of human imagination. I love that. The very idea that an idea is a living thing. And so I'm going to go on and tell you a story about a hospital that we work for. This is not a picture of the hospitals, but is a building they own. It's not far from where I work in Washington State. And the hospital owns this funky old building. It's a big box building. Now, hospitals are really good at some things and not so good at others. One thing that a hospital is really good at is emergent and episodic events. If I fall off my roof, or if I have a heart attack, or if I have cancer, I go to the hospital and they put all the resources to fix me up, putting me back together and sending me home. What hospitals are not as good on is dealing with chronically ill patients, people that never really get better and they have to manage a disease. And so this hospital is no different. And they have, in their organization, they have some 20 different departments and clinics spread out through 2 cities to care for their chronic patients. And so the administrative team has a seed of an idea, and that's what this little diagram here shows. They have a seed of an idea that says, if we take all these 20 different departments and clinics and we put them in one building in one place, number one, we can save money on rent. And number two, because many of these patients have to go to one or more of our departments, it's more convenient for them. And so we're commissioned to say, hey, can you figure out a way to put them all in this 80,000 square foot old funky building and create sort of what they called a wellness center? We'd like to create a wellness center. And they commissioned us to do a discovery around what the best practices about what a wellness center is. And so we went out and we went looking, and if wellness center, what comes to mind is Pelletrons and juice bars and buff 20-somethings in spandex, which is not the patient types that they're trying to care for. And we had a hard time finding a best practice of any kind in this way. And we extended our search, and we found an organization in Alaska called South Central Foundation. And South Central is a not-for-profit that cares for Indigenous people, gives healthcare for Indigenous people in Alaska. And they've done an interesting thing, and they've been published for it, and they've produced some really positive metrics around better outcomes when they tried to integrate Western medicine with tribal forms of healthcare and healthcare delivery. And I was fascinated by this and went to Alaska. We spent some time with them to see what they did. And really what they did was they took the science of medicine, but they also used the concept of community care in healthcare. Health comes from the community. And this is really contrary to Western medicine that is really big on HIPAA privacy, doctor-patient confidentiality, discretion, and, well, frankly, secrecy. Our Western way of medicine is really quite discreet, whereas theirs is really about healing in the center of community. And so we came back from this experience with this kind of key concept about how do we apply community to the healthcare process. And so this next picture I have here is of our client group here. This is our group. And there's some really interesting things that you can see and can't quite see is these folks were from the 20 different departments and clinics that came together for a week-long design event. That's how we started the process. And what's interesting about this group is, number one, they don't know each other, which makes it interesting. Number two, there were no doctors and there were no administrators in this group. These are all frontline staff workers who actually touched the patient. And as a result, there is very little power differential across this group. And number three observation is that all the genius that we needed was in this group and in this room. We didn't have to go outside or find any other expertise to get us to where we had to go. So in the week-long event, I can't tell you about the whole thing, but let me just tell you about two of the pieces that we did together. And so talking about imagination and how you tap into someone's imagination, we use some tools that are kind of fun. And this one, what's demonstrated here is you see a little piece of paper on the upper right-hand side, and it's a question that we asked everyone individually. And the question is this: how does community show up in nature? And we gave them a pencil and we gave them this paper and we said, we want you to take 15 minutes and not write, but draw 7 ways that community shows up in nature, because nature has already solved the problem a long time ago. We just need to copy it. And this is a stretch for most people who are used to talking and not used to drawing, and it accesses another part of their brain. And so we had everyone do this and everyone made their presentations. So we saw 210 different solutions. And this one was done by Amy Caruso. And you can see there, she's got, a pack of elephants in the middle, and you can see some bees in a hive, and you can see some ducks. But in the bottom, you see those funny plants. And she says, I'm learning how to garden, and I'm learning how to grow corn. And I have learned that the only way that you can get corn to grow ears of corn is that you have to have a lot of stalks and you have to plant them very closely together and they cross pollinate. And that set a bell off. People go, that rang. That was like, that was a neon idea. And so talked about it, came around, and it buzzed in the group. And further in the week, we went on to the next process, which we call a paper doll exercise. And the way we design here is, again, we don't do the design work. We produce a big floor plan of the building, this old building, and we have all the programmatic pieces, the rooms that they need, exam rooms and treatment rooms and all those kinds of things, cut out in little pieces of paper. And they sit down in groups of 4 or 5 around tables together. And we say, okay, lay out your clinic the way it should work, which is kind of intimidating, but in about 2.5 hours, people begin to work. And what's fascinating about this process is it creates a lot of dialogue, which is important in a group of people, and it creates tension. And that's an interesting reality simply because anytime creativity shows up in force, there'll almost always be tension. And how to navigate that tension is one of the most interesting facilitation pieces that we go through. And you can kind of see the tension in the lower left-hand side. There is dialogue and then there's debate. And multiple options were selected or are developed, and then they had to get it down to one option. And so this is what they came up with. And to describe it is pretty interesting. Here's the paper dolls you see here. And in the center are all the workstations for all the staff workers in an open work area. And around the outside are all the patient encounter spaces. And down here in the front, there's actually a community space. And this centerpiece is called the cornfield. And the only rule they have for the cornfield is that clinical staff cannot sit next to anyone else that's their discipline. They have to sit next to someone foreign to them with a different discipline. And it's the concept of propinquity, of people close together connecting. And so you can see this is what they came up with. This is what we drew. You can kind of see again, there's the cornfield and there's a community space in front and all the encounter space on the outside. And this is what we built. And so in this picture, you see this yellow wall. That's where the cornfield is. And this is the big open space in the community space. And so we turned this building into this. This project we did probably almost 9 years ago. And what was delightful about it was that it really outperformed its projections in the first year. It was very successful and has continued to be so. And in fact, it formed a community, which is fascinating, of chronic patients who are typically kind of isolated. They're home and alone, but they would come here once or several times a week, seeing the same faces and the same patients and the same providers, and they became a community in their own right, which was pretty rich. And what's fascinating is it's continued to evolve in the services that it provides, and it continues to expand its own community in the community. And so, maybe to end this presentation, I come back again to these 3 concepts about what is the connection in a group of people? How might you access their imagination? And what ideas will evolve? And what's interesting, the idea evolves as it passes through the imagination and it's passed around the circle of people. And an idea grows and changes, and it reveals itself. So that's my story. Thanks for listening in. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ed. You're on mute. Ed, you're still on mute.
Ed, you're on mute. I thought I had unmuted. Kent, I just want to say thank you to start with. I was trying to say that I was excited about your presentation before we got here today, because we'd had a separate, prep call, and you blew me away here with fired up my imagination and really touched my heart here as well. I want to invite people again to put questions into the Mentimeter. It allows us to kind of like surface the best ones, and I will also kind of kick things off with an initial question for you, Ken. So while folks may be thinking about what they might want to ask of you or comments to make, one of the questions that came to my mind as we were preparing and as I heard you today is this idea of self-management that I think you've taken to a new level in a way. If we think about the Teal principle of self-management, because you've developed a system that really extends that beyond your own organization, your architecture organization, into your client companies. And so I'm curious if you can speak about how this might apply to other fields. What other fields, professional fields beyond architecture, might be able to use this kind of radical approach to participation and designing with clients, not designing for them?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think design becomes a big term beyond just buildings, right? We really design every reality that we know and that we have. And so I think what is increasingly becoming clear to me is that the design problems that we're faced with, even in architecture, are becoming complex as opposed to complicated. If you've ever seen that diagram about what is complex, and complex problems are ones that the outcome is not clearly known at the beginning, right? It's going to show up, and the only way that a complex problem is addressed is with a group of diverse people. And I think that's becoming true in more and more sectors of the world that we live in. So whether it's designing an organizational structure, designing an operational process, designing any number of things, to find ways to draw everyone into that process, I think is incredibly valuable and always will produce a better outcome as a result. So yeah, I think it goes way beyond just doing buildings. It fits in all manner.
Thanks for that, Ken. I love that you're bringing in the complexity theory there, and it makes a lot of sense. And it could be applied to other organizations and their work. And I see we have a question here that I'll surface now in the Mentimeter system. How have the experiences of building this wellness center influenced your organization? It's been 9 years so since you did it. Like, what's been the short-term impact, long-term impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and and Travis is aware of this as well. Is that we began to understand that you can't do this for other clients if you don't do it for yourself, and so we began to work towards becoming a level organization, a Teal organization, probably 5-6 years ago. I know that's when I began talking with Travis. And and so that's been a journey for us, and it's been there's ups and downs, to be really honest. I have to be true about that our profession is a pretty traditional one, and it's traditionally very hierarchical, and it's it's been a stretch for our staff. We've lost some staff. We got some new staff who've come in, and I think maybe to the degree that we've been successful, which has to do with, building the autonomy of our individual staff and drawing out their genius and recognizing it and helping them to make that as part of the team. We've had staff who have come here and have left and returned back to us because of what they felt was the culture and the community of the firm, which is probably the best indication of what works for us, what's been successful.
That is a great sign right there. There's another question that kind of hints at what you were getting at a second ago, Kent, and it's not always easy. And maybe you were talking more internally, but a question that came in here is, what were the hardest parts of doing this process? I assume we'll come back to the client work, the wellness center. And was there early or even late resistance to your approach?
Yeah, there was a lot of learning here. And it goes back to the earlier piece that I mentioned about the triad. It requires a lot more discovery work on our part to understand the clients that we serve. and understand their willingness to let anybody and everybody participate in the decision-making process. We've had some that have failed, quite frankly, because the power differential in the group was just too high, and the solutions that were really creatively developed were rejected. So there's been times where it has not worked well, and other times where I really believe it has really enhanced the organization. And I'd say one place where we've had success, a lot of success, has been with indigenous tribal groups. That there are a lot in where we are, and because they do have a more of a communal tradition about how they work together and how they make decisions. And so I think that's one of the biggest keys, is to simply understand the dynamics of the folks that we're working for.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, staying on that question of power differential, another question has come in, and these are great questions. Keep putting them in the Mentimeter, folks. I'll keep sharing them here with Ken. How does working in this way relate to other systems of power and oppression? And just a small question for you, Ken. And does this in any way address paternalistic and racist patterns that show up in so many of our systems? So, giving you some big things to chew on there.
Wow. Yeah, we're doing a project right now, and I'm in Seattle, and we have gotten a commission to work for an organization called the Tubman Center for Health and Freedom, which is an African American organization that was started just 2 years ago to provide healthcare for marginalized people. And what's fascinating about this group is that they are committed to. We're helping them build a 40,000 square foot clinical facility, and they're very, very clear about they do not wish to do it after the pattern of what they've actually described white racist healthcare system that does not serve them well. And for all of you who follow the news and understand that our healthcare system has been really stressed by the pandemic, and the loss of nurses and staff that are working in a pretty inhumane system. And their intention is really to redesign the system itself to work for their community. And it's been really fascinating. We're still early in the process, but they have been quite insistent. They're not looking to hire a subject matter expert in the form of their architect, other than make sure we comply to codes and things like that. But they would prefer to build their own system and then have us critique it. And so this methodology of letting them, design the process themselves has been really, really interesting. And what's hopeful about it is that our healthcare system is in so much pain. And oftentimes with change doesn't come from the center of the organization. It usually comes from the outside. And I my hope and dream is that it is the marginalized people, the canaries in the coal mine, really, that are most affected by a system that doesn't work, that might bring that change. So yeah, I think there's a big piece of equity and in this process that we've been going through, and we'll see what the outcome is.
I love that. What a cool sounding project, and again, kudos to you to be that open to it, putting your ego, or your organizational ego, to sort of be more the editor figure as opposed to the writer. As I'm hearing you right, using my profession as a writer. What you just said reminded me, Ken, of an interesting finding. I come from out of the Great Place to Work organization, where I did a lot of research. And one of the things we discovered is that, to your canary in the coal mine point, the experience of marginal folks during difficult times, like recessionary periods, seen in like employee surveys, was predictive of how well the organization did later. So if the organization created a good experience for women, for wage earning, low wage men, people of color, those folks are having a good experience. Typically, the organization thrived later, across the recession. So I think you're right about healthy change often does come from the periphery, from the margins, and so hoping that you'll have something similar there with your project. Are there any kind of interesting opening signs of that? You mentioned that you've had to put away creative ideas in the past. What are you seeing so far? If you can say a bit more on the Seattle project.
Well, let me offer another observation about that's been really rich for me is in a couple of these kinds of projects, and same as when we've done tribal work, I find my role in this methodology is coming in as an outsider. And with this group, I can tell you, I'm the only old white guy in the group. which is a very humbling position to be in, but to be an outsider and to come into a group that's maybe actually quite tight is really wonderful, because as an outsider, you oftentimes see what they do not. Mm-hmm. And that's a unique value of being an outsider. And the tools, this whole tools of accessing imagination and pursuing an idea really is part of that tool set of being the outsider and helping to reveal things that they may not know or see. So I think that's a significant piece of this process.
Awesome. I've got another question that came in the Mentimeter as well here. Relating to this idea of applying it elsewhere, your process, Ken, you mentioned that your organization is moving towards teal. Actually, just another question. Are there ways that you all tell if this is moving you in a good direction? Any kind of meta-analysis that this is even the right direction? So again, I guess you've been moving toward this teal way of working, and teal around the world is all about what are the signs that this is good or not so great for y'all?
Yeah, thanks. Let me think on that. I think it has a lot to do with the kinds of organizations we serve. It's kind of obvious that some places it won't work. And in fact, if we attempt to do it, if we attempt to get into an organization and bring this, and at their core, they're not going to accept it. Not only is it difficult for them, it's difficult for our staff. It's kind of a painful thing. And we've encountered that more than once, that there are some organizations who are just not trending this way. It's not the way they work. They're very mechanistic. They're very top down. They rely on standards, and they treat their employees like interchangeable parts rather than people. And however, I think there's a trend in the marketplace of becoming more organic in the way that organizations become living systems rather than machines. And I think the navigation is that we've got to find those organizations to serve them. This is not going to be one size fits all, and it won't work for everybody.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense that you're going to look for these, at least the curious companies, right, or organizations that are starting down their path, perhaps. I want to invite Dean to speak his comment or question. It's an interesting one. You talk about move to process, and the architecture is facilitator as opposed to SME. Can you say a bit more about that, Dean? Maybe invite Kent to reflect on your comment.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And hey, Kent, I love the whole thing, just as a way of simplifying what I'm feeling right now. But I think for me, there's an interesting sort of tipping point in the move towards self-management and sort of teal, which is at some point, the subject matter expert who's been holding knowledge and power understands they slide into a support role, rather than actually being the holder of the entire thing. And I think, for me, I think that's really shown in yours, where you're servants to a community process rather than coming in, and so you're in essence designing a building to suit community need, as opposed to designing a building that in some way meets whatever the sort of incentives around the architecture firm are in a bigger systemic way. So it sort of ties into what that is. But and I know here in Australia, there's a lot around sort of community consultation as part of architecture projects to design facilities, but that's a consultation. That's not actually a handing the process over, which are like, I mean, they sound subtle, but the difference is, you know, as you can see in your project, is actually really significant. But the organizational architecture has to go along with the physical architecture to be able to do that. And when I try and explain that to friends of mine who are architects, they don't understand the difference, but they think they're doing what you're doing. And I can't really help them to understand fundamentally the difference between the two. So how would you explain, I suppose how would you explain the difference to architects about the difference in that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the hard lesson I've learned, I've been doing this for like 40 years now, is that there's so much change, especially say in healthcare, is that the organizational design happens concurrent with the building design. In other words, we've often met clients who, if you come and say, hey, how many rooms do you need and what's the adjacencies, they don't really know because their marketplace is changing so rapidly that they don't know how to answer the question. And so you end up designing both their operational model, to some degree their governance structure, as well as the building, and those all come together. They inform each other in a really, really big way. And I think especially the problem of being a subject matter expert is this very backward-looking expertise. I've designed 100 clinics, and so I'll tell you how to do this next one. And it's almost conditioned to not be aware of what's trying to emerge, of what's evolving in the marketplace. It's almost a hindrance to that. And so I think that coming with that different posture of saying something is emerging in this mesh-up of all these different pieces of what makes an organization work, including its facilities, is incredibly important posture. But you're right. We're not trained to be that way as architects. we're technicians.
And for me, the processes often aren't even allowed to be integrated. You know, it's physical design before you're worrying about any of the like organizational components that are there. And I mean, I've been involved in sort of nursing teams and things where, or I have friends who are designing hospitals, for example, as architects, you know, and they're only talking about the physical design and how that serves the way the rooms are now. And all of the organizational pieces and how the hospital operates are off the table. And we're only talking about the physical parts. And, you know, and everyone looks at me cross-eyed when, you know, I'm like, well, can we try talking about these things all at once?
Are you an architect, or are you in the healthcare industry?
I'm in neither. And, but I mean, I often facilitator between all of these parts, trying to do more integrated design and work. And so, yeah, I mean, like all of us, will often find ourselves in the middle of this complex puzzle where you have a giant healthcare system that seems very resistant to change. And it's like, can we have the architect and the nurses in the room right now and the decision makers above the nurses who are holding their processes, so we can like have a fun play with all of those things? But instead it's like, no, there's been an architecture tender going out. They have to consult as part of their design process, and whatever it is about healthcare system will come later.
You know, I like the word that you just used there about play. Because frankly, that is really what, when you do get nurses and architects and doctors in the best of the world, it's play. And, you know, and part of the things, again, we learned, like we showed, is that to use tools that you put your hands to, why we call it a gaming board, you know, it's play. And to unleash that playfulness with a group of diverse people is, again, that's how you click open imagination and new ideas that come forth. And so, gosh, you're completely right. It's you know, the segmentation and compartmentalization of traditional design and construction is really antithetical to that. It's very painful.
Ken, I want to build on, you know, one of the pieces of what Dean was saying there about the subject matter expert, and that has to do with, you know, I guess I touched on it a little bit before, but the idea of ego, and I'm really fascinated by the way you have kind of tamed your own ego along your 40-year stretch. Like, some might say you're in the period of your career where everyone should look to you for ideas, right? You've been doing this for 4 decades. And the architect is a sort of classical godlike figure, you know, who who creates the space and determines where we're going to live and how we're going to move through the world. And you've become more of a storyteller and a facilitator and a host. And what has this been like to move toward this more relaxed ego? Has it been painful at times, liberating? What can you say about that?
Gosh, it's been a lot of fun. You and I talked about that earlier about how I'm trending toward becoming like you, a journalist. I think it has. There's way more fun in following your own curiosity to learn about a group of people and see what they have inside of them. And one of the great learnings I think that I've been going through is to understand how to design what I would call fateful questions, the questions that opens the group up and opens individuals up to think more deeply about what it is they're trying to do. And so yeah, I think that's probably true. It is a very egocentric profession. I agree. We've been trained that way. And I think of the first book I read was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And
Right.
Being a heroic architect, the heroic architect model is pretty strong. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is emerging more and more. I think it's a shift that's happening. Hopefully it's showing up everywhere, this whole desire to be a part of instead of to master the process and the outcome.
May it be so. I know what the other territory I focus a lot on is masculinity, and you're talking about moving from this more conventional, what I call it confined masculinity, where you have to be in charge and hold on tight to control, to more like open-handed. Let's collaborate. Let's be in play. Like, I love the playfulness is such a great avenue to change. So let me invite any other folks to put questions in the Metameter or even in the chat here. It's been a great conversation. There is another question in the chat I want to make sure I get to, Ken, here. You've talked about these ways of working that still seem relatively niche to this questioner. What would be needed in order for these ways of working to go mainstream? And would that even be good?
Oh, wow. I would like it to go more mainstream. It's still rare. What would be needed to make it go mainstream? One of the things that I've watched over since we started this project, which was 8 years ago, and we've evolved along with it. I've certainly seen the continued amalgamation, consolidation of corporations that are coming together and building larger and larger organizations. And that's really happened in our field, especially where hospitals are bought by other hospitals and the systems get bigger and bigger. And the only way to manage that is to create, well, it's not the only way, but what I've seen is that they tend to rely more on centralized control, standardization, and really strict protocol. And so when we did this project 8 years ago, the hospital was very happy and free to let us have full access to their frontline workers, the people that actually touch their patients. That's happening less today. And I can't help but to think that what's happening in healthcare now, nurses that are retiring out because the work is too stressful, doctors that are retiring out because it's become so mechanized, that I'd love to think that there's going to be a backlash to that, and the doors will open again, and the hospitals will say, we don't know how to do this right, and we need help. And so I'd love to think that marketplace is going to open up, but that may be aspirational, frankly.
Yeah, you're describing in some ways the counter trend, but with some hope, because it's breaking. If I'm hearing you right, it's something that Frederick Laloux talked about today. Is the system is crumbling as we watch it. All the standardization, centralization doesn't seem to be solving the nursing crisis you described, or the physician burnout, patient outcomes even. So it seems like we've got these two counter trends running at the same time.
Gee, I would love to hear from anybody else's here what they're seeing in the marketplaces that they serve, because I'm curious if that isn't truly emerging.
Yeah, feel free to take yourself off mute if anyone wants to chime in on that question.
I mean, I think you're right. Like, I mean, I think this things that you're talking about in the healthcare system are true across oil and gas, across our gender equality, racial equality, like all of these. Even free speech in America seems radically reduced and suspect across a number of dimensions, and seems like all of these things, like if there's good that's in them, it's getting people riled up that this old way of doing it is definitely not going to work. It seems like I don't like it. It seems like more and more people are feeling it across more and more dimensions, and so maybe it's like loading the spring, and it's a question if the spring is going to snap back or break completely. Is kind of what it seems like.
It's a good allegory.
Thanks, Travis.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. It's like I believe it is coming forth. Will it come forth this year? Will it be 10 years? Will it be 50 years? But we know the system, at least the healthcare system, which is a conservative system, is not working. I mean, we had in our state, we had the hospital association came out and said, hey, we're going to see in the next few years 2 or 3 hospitals in our state that are just going to simply have to close their doors. They're just not surviving. So there's a lot of indicators that says that the American healthcare system, which is the most expensive and least effective, in many ways, has to change. And so the question is, when will that occur, and what part can we play in that?
Folks, any other kind of comments or questions on this? Maybe what you're seeing in your industries? Dean, I'd be curious if you're seeing similar tensions, perhaps in Australia or particular fields you play in, or anyone else who wants to speak up.
Yeah, I think if I'm talking, it's kind of interesting. I feel like we have a tension, which is, Kent, what you're talking about, the sort of this move towards larger systems and centralization. But we also have, sort of, it's similar to yours in that sort of coming out of Indigenous communities and this rise of respect for traditional systems. And, that's getting stronger in Australia on the whole, which I think goes alongside a fairly sort of, in our teal sort of way, thinking about sort of green and teal directions. I think in a way, Indigenous systems help with that sort of consciousness a fair bit, which is nice because it levels what have been really sort of traditional power structures and centralization and subject matter expertise, and hands a lot of that back to community. So I think that like you're probably sitting at a bit of the crux of that in working with traditional communities in architecture. That's going on in a lot of our systems where, I was sitting with a client yesterday, and talking about sort of we have to, a lot of organizations have to do things called reconciliation action plans. And that's, trying to do a lot of the same kind of work in handing power back to other stakeholders, trying to make processes more democratized, or at least, have different sort of power centers in them and things as well. So I think there's an interesting tension that, I know sitting here in Australia, we sit in the middle of often, which is adding other centers of gravity rather than just the traditional white, mostly male, mostly subject matter expertise. And I mean, and I think, and like you said, Ed, that actually has huge benefits once you start doing that. But it does require those moves towards process orientation, rather than just sort of only governance or decision maker orientation in the system. But that, that's a conscious move that's hard to get, it's developing in Australia. I think there's some real challenges around our national culture and resisting that move actually a fair bit as well. people just want to substitute one power for another type of power rather than sitting into process and the uncertainty of that. So, yeah, I love that you could be trusted to sort of hold that on behalf of multiple stakeholders. I think that's a very difficult position, but also one that's really essential. So,
yeah, it's interesting. And Ed, you and I were talking a little bit about this in terms of patriarchal systems and whatnot. And what's interesting, what's evolved for us, we've had this firm for 30 years, and it's evolved to the point now, and I think there's commentary here about we are 70% female, 30% male, which is an interesting flip. We've evolved that way, and mostly because I think that we have found that our women architects are much more aware of the dynamics of groups of people, and are better able to facilitate and navigate in it. And that all happened by accident. So, but it's true. And maybe that's one of the hopeful things to see, is that it's becoming much less dominant, hierarchically based, and much more level in that regard. But it's interesting. We have a thing that we do in our office called Fireside Chat. And our goal is to bring people from the clients that we serve to come in and talk to us about what they do, what is healthcare, and how do they serve it, just so that our technical people can understand it. And what's been surprising to me is the level of passion that our healthcare providers bring when you open them up in a conversation. They deeply love what they do. They're caregivers. They're empathetic people. But one of them said this. I really stuck with me. He says, our healthcare system, the science is amazing, and the social delivery structure is awful. And I go, oh, that's a really interesting perspective. The tension between those two things, that we can do amazing, medical treatment, but our social delivery of that is so difficult. Yeah.
That's a striking observation. Yeah, like we're kind of miracles, and yet we're so backwards on the social part of it and the delivery part. One thing I was going to add on the hopeful side, Kent, it's interesting to hear you mention how your office kind of evolved into a more female oriented. You got more 70% female.
Right.
Going back to this question of structures in other places and ways of working in collapse, I do some work with masculinity and compassion that shows that even some of the most hyper masculine cultures or settings are really at a breaking point also, like police departments. They're now embracing a police officer wellness movement that is getting, more soft than the typical guy is ever used to. Like they're talking about mental health. They're talking about trauma. They're talking about the need to develop a more compassionate culture within policing. And that's, you see similar things happening in the military. You even see it also with the professional sports teams, where the science of performance has gotten people like, has shows you that the Steph Currys and the folks that are the teams that focus on joy and camaraderie are actually the most successful ones. They work on the connection piece. They're less about the dominant barking coach who's going to say everything. Like let's get the best ideas from all the different players here. So, and the different lower level coaches too. So there is hope if I look at through that masculinity lens in some of these hyper masculine territories, that there may be some better days ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. I think you're right. I hope this is where it's going. And we desperately need it, don't we?
We really do. Yeah. I want to make sure we haven't missed any questions from folks. I'm going to take a look at the Mentimeter on of all these great comments and questions that have come up already. And Kent, your presentation has been really inspiring to me, and I think other folks. I think we lost Dean there. I think maybe we're ready to wrap up then, unless you I want to give you a chance to make any kind of closing remarks. Kent, anything else you want to say we haven't talked about up to now?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again for just the opportunity to tell the story and to hear feedback. I am really curious about what else is happening out there, and my sense is that there's a groundswell of movement in this direction in so many different places, and Travis, like you described as well, and really nice to find a community of folks that are dealing in the same sort of a process.
Super. Well, typically you're bringing the curiosity in the community, in some ways the tamed ego, Kent, that I've taken so much from you. I really admire how you show up here and in your organization. And I want to invite folks to, if you'd like to stop by to talk further, I'm going to give you a link in the chat for what's called a spatial chat. And that can be some more informal conversation, takeaways we've learned from Kent's story here. I'll be there in just a few minutes. And again, Kent, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your Teal Around the World experience, everybody.